Good afternoon. Welcome to our panel, which will examine the issue of free speech at Texas public universities. My name is Tom Lindsay, and I direct the TPPF Center for Innovation in Education. Thank you. Thank you. At the start of this panel, let me just remark to those of you who are seeking CLE accreditation by the State Bar of Texas, this session is CLE accredited. To receive the CLE credits, you need to sign in on the clipboard that's located in the back of the room. Thank you. It's a real honor for me to present to you the three individuals who will be talking about the campus free speech issue this afternoon. Each has a wealth of experience in the issue of higher education generally and the relationship between campus free speech and higher education. To my immediate right, many of you will recognize Senator Kel Seliger. Senator Seliger was first elected to the Texas Senate in 2004, representing District 31, which spans 37 counties. He's a graduate of Dartmouth, right? He spent 35 years in the steel industry before coming to the Senate, and since coming to the Senate, he has been a consistent leader on public education policy issues. Senator Seliger has been a guest on our panels in the past. It's great to have you back, Senator. To Senator Seliger's immediate right, it's Dr. Stanley Kurtz, who's a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and a contributing editor at National Review Online. Dr. Kurtz has helped lead national criticism of the College Board's revisionist AP U.S. history curriculum, on which he has testified before several state legislatures. He's also co-author of the Model Campus Free Speech legislation published by the Arizona Goldwater Institute. And he's testified on this proposal before the House Judiciary Committee, as well as before state legislatures in Florida, Wisconsin, and Michigan. To his right is Marcus Fotinas. Marcus now works with Turning Point USA to help spread the ideas of free speech, limited government, and free markets on college campuses throughout the country. Marcus is former student body president at the University of Colorado Boulder. Yes. And during his tenure as student body president, Marcus spearheaded efforts to pass successfully Colorado's state legislation to rid all public institutions of higher education throughout the state of their quote-unquote free speech zones. In order to ensure that students' First Amendment rights are protected to the utmost degree. Please join me in welcoming all three of our discussants. Well, despite the fact that just about everybody now has heard for years the bad news stories about disruptions of free speech events on campus, speaker disinvitations, campus shoutdowns, or what's called the heckler's veto, safe spaces, trigger warnings, speech codes, speech zones. Well, all of that is somber and alarming news. At the same time, I think as you hear from these three gentlemen, in the big picture, we have a good news story to bring you. And the reason I say it's a good news story is for the following. Because concern over protecting free speech on our public university campuses has gone bipartisan. Right? To date, 26 different state legislatures have considered free speech bills. 11 have passed free speech bills. Let me just, for our audience, give you a little bit of historical background to better put into context what you're going to hear. About 100 years ago, the Supreme Court developed a different approach to the First Amendment than what had been the case previously, incorporating the First Amendment's protections against the states. Now, we saw this first in the issue of higher education in the late 50s. In 1959, 9 African American students at Alabama State College participated in a sit-in at a segregated cafe in the Montgomery County Courthouse. The restaurant refused to serve them, and it ordered them to leave. Then, when Alabama State College learned of their actions, it expelled them without notice or hearing. The case was Dixon versus Alabama State Board of Education. Now, these students fortunately appealed, and a federal court ruled in their favor, holding that state universities have to obey the First Amendment like all other state agencies. And this was the first time that due process rights of students were recognized judicially. And then just 2 years later, in Edwards versus South Carolina, the Supreme Court struck down the breach of peace convictions of 187 African American students who had marched to the South Carolina State House to protest segregation. The court ruled that the arrests violated the students' First Amendment rights. Most important, the Supreme Court in Edwards stressed that government cannot criminalize, quote, the peaceful expression of even unpopular views. Right? Several scholars who have devoted their life to studying the history of the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s have said the following. Linda Lobston at University of Pennsylvania says, quote, the First Amendment was the foundation of the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. Robert Richards, another scholar, says the First Amendment was the key tool of the civil rights movement, and rightly so. And this is what I mean when I say I think that while all of us are alarmed, and rightly alarmed, that this is, or at least can be, a good news story, given the fact that a majority of the states in the Union are considering free speech bills, and that some have already passed them, and more are looking at them, given the fact that we all recognize that the civil rights movement could not have succeeded without the protection of the First Amendment. What we'll be hearing about today as we talk to these gentlemen is some of the issues that have attracted the most national attention. For example, what is called the heckler's veto, which I will let them explain. And then finally, one last thing before we go over to them, the good news part. In 2015, the University of Chicago alarmed over the rise of campus disinvitations and shout-downs and safe spaces and trigger warnings and speech codes. The University of Chicago put out a statement on free expression. The good news is that since they did that, 54 universities to date have signed on. And this is what I mean when I say the issue has gone bipartisan. Joining the University of Chicago in its defense of campus free speech, Columbia, Georgetown, Princeton, right? American University, University of Colorado system, University of Missouri system, and that's a really encouraging development for those, and as for all of us, because we all love free speech and we all recognize that we can't really learn if we're not free to think, right? So this is what I mean when I say that I hope this turns out to be a good news panel for you. And with that said, I'll begin to start the discussion here with our panelists. And the first thing I want to do is sort of let them tell you how they became involved in this issue. All three of them come at this in different roles, as scholar, as legislator, as student activists. I want them to sort of give you the on-the-ground feel for this. Who would like to begin?
All right, well, Tom, I'll just give a little background as to how this Goldwater proposal came about. I've been writing for National Review on higher education, among other issues, for some time, maybe 15 years. And then in November of 2015, we saw the controversies at Yale University and at Mizzou. I don't know if you all remember that. This is when at Yale there was a big controversy over Halloween costumes. But right around that time, the conservative group at Yale, the William F. Buckley Society, was holding a conference on freedom of speech. And to my amazement, various students tried to disrupt and shut down this conference. This was a conference on free speech, and it was attacked and shut down, and police had to escort these students and the speakers out. So at that point, I realized that 15 years of work at National Review Online had been a complete waste of time on my part. And it was obvious that things in the academy were getting worse, not better, and I thought another approach was needed. And that's when I came up with the ideas that became a big part of the Goldwater proposal. Now, we put this together. I was working with the Goldwater Institute on this, and we happened to go public with this proposed campus free speech legislation on January 31st of 2017. And on February 2nd of 2017, this was the Milo Yiannopoulos riot at Berkeley, California. You might remember, where there was arson and serious physical injury, and the whole thing was canceled. And after that, the terrible shout-downs of Charles Murray and Heather McDonald and many others. And we had no idea that this was going to be the case. We thought we'd put this model out there and maybe a state or two would be interested in it, but it came out at just the right time, and it shows you that this problem is increasing. And frankly, I suspect that with the 2020 election coming up, we're going to see another spike in problems, so many of them clustered around the 2016 election's immediate aftermath. So this is what got me into it. I'll say one other just quick thing personally. I was a graduate student. At the time, I was at the University of California at Berkeley. And there had been many shoutdowns in the 60s, but they stopped for 10 years or so. And the first shoutdown of the current era was Ronald Reagan's UN ambassador, Jean Kirkpatrick. She spoke at the University of California at Berkeley, and she was shouted down. Now, that wasn't very surprising. There were a lot of radical folks at Berkeley who might want to shout someone down. But what shocked me at the time was when I read in the Daily Cal, the student paper, professors saying that oppressors don't have free speech rights and she ought to have been shouted down. And so that actually started to turn me conservative. I wasn't conservative when I grew up. And so this, in a way, is a fruition of that, and something that began in a small way there has become a tremendous problem, mostly because we haven't done anything with the people who do the shoutdowns. We haven't had any discipline for them, and the problem has ballooned for decades.
Guess I'm next. When Tom invited me to speak at the event, I checked the dates, and I was really excited to find out that it was this week rather than next week, because on Monday, I start my very first day of the last semester of class at University of Colorado Boulder. So timing worked out great, and today I really want to bring a student perspective to the table. But first, a little bit about Turning Point USA. It's the fastest growing and largest youth conservative movement throughout the country. We have a presence on over 1,300 college and high school campuses. Each year, or up to this point, we've had over 500,000 face-to-face conversations with students about free markets, limited government. We just hosted an event last month with over 3,000 attendees in attendance. And then something else that's really cool, in just 6 years, as long as Turning Point's been around, we've had over 4.2 billion impressions on all of our social media platforms. This is winning the culture war, especially with the younger generations. We will always have the political war, but if we lose the cultural war as conservatives, then there's nothing left to fight for. And we're winning that on social media, online, and on college campuses. But the main reason why I was asked to speak here today was when I was an 18-year-old freshman at University of Colorado Boulder. Yes, there are a few conservatives there. I decided to run for student body president. No idea what I was doing, but I decided I knew enough about how it worked. I was going to run. Ran for office, and then found myself, 19 years old, being approached with not only a $24 million budget to sign off on for our student body, but then also a free speech issue that our students had brought to my attention. They had said, and our policy backed what students had said, students weren't allowed to go throughout campus collecting petition signatures for their civic engagement. If you wanted to speak freely, spontaneously, you had to do it in a single confined space, which actually about the same size as this room for all 33,000 students on our campus. And I decided, like, hey, we're going to do something about it. We've started by passing something just through our student government saying that the First Amendment is going to apply to every square inch of the University of Colorado at Boulder. Administration did not like that, but it got through, passed unanimously. And then we took the fight down to the state capitol, where we were able to get bipartisan support, where we had a split state legislature at the time. Our Senate was Republican majority, our House was Democrat majority. So we had a Senate sponsor as a Republican and a Democrat House sponsor. We were able to get that bill through to remove free speech zones throughout the entire state with bipartisan support. There was not a single no vote on the bill, and then signed by our Democrat governor. I think this is proof not only at the student level, this is proof that not only at the student level, but also at the state legislature level, it's an issue that can and should bring bipartisan support, because it is not a left or right issue. When one voice starts getting silenced, it impacts every student on campus negatively and their ability to learn, ability to challenge their thoughts. And to be here today, it's really special, because this is a fight that I've been fighting now for over 3.5 years, and it's getting better. And like Tom said, I think it is a good news story. And I'm excited to share with you my experiences as well as experiences I've learned from other students.
Dr. Lindsay asked us to sort of share our exposure to concepts and principles of free speech. When one is a city councilman and a mayor and a state legislator, free speech is important every single day, because those of us in government learn a lot about dissidents. They happen all the time. You're in a city council meeting, and here come the dissidents, citizens who disagree and have a right to disagree. I remember during the time that I was mayor, I was presiding at an assembly, and Rosa Parks was speaking, and obviously it was absolutely great. But there was some sort of demonstration outside, and it was pretty raucous and pretty loud. And people said, well, Mayor, what are you going to do? And I said, well, I'm going to urge Mrs. Parks to speak louder. But our rights are what she is all about, and those people outside are exercising their right of free speech. One thing that we need to believe in and work hard for is to realize that no one has waived, will waive, or can waive the First Amendment. I think there's a reason why freedom of speech is in the First Amendment. It is fundamental to almost every other right that we have, and along with it, the rights to assembly and things like that. If there is a complication with the Goldwater Institute bill, it sort of seeks to address sort of every conceivable situation in statute, and that's very, very tough to do. Once again, against whom will the sanctions be? When we pass laws like that, it always says there is penalty. Well, who is going to be held responsible for that penalty? And this situation is not a new one. Back in the late 60s, Colgate University, somebody's student group had invited Abby Hoffman to speak at the university, and as you can imagine, there was some outcry from students who were not that kind of students who believed that kind of thing. And so, and it was at times obscene, some sort of unusual and unsavory biological functions with an American flag. And what did they do? They let the whole thing on. And as a matter of speaking, a university environment that is all about discussion and debate and ideas, and the debates of merits of ideas are the perfect places for dissidents. And so what happens if this model bill, which did not pass the Texas legislature last time, there's a good chance it won't this time, what happens? What happens adversely? Absolutely nothing. As Dr. Lindsay pointed out, and this is important, there are 54 campuses that have in one way or another signed on to those basic principles, and we're seeing more and more every day. One of the best parts of my job is I spent a lot of time interacting with college presidents. There was a situation at Texas Southern where a member of the Texas legislature was invited, the invitation rescinded, and people were all up in arms. And you know what the real situation was? Because they have principles for inviting speakers in, that if they're going to use college facilities, they must be a college-recognized student group, which is not very difficult to do. They must have an appointment for the room and the time, so the school can determine if they need to have security and things like that. Other than that, go right ahead. Little Stephen F. Austin in Nacogdoches. I recently got to talk to their interim president, and their principle is, we need the time, and we need the place, we need the logistical descriptions, and everybody is welcome. There was an incident that happened on the University of Texas campus not recently, and it was a demonstration in favor of the confirmation of Justice Kavanaugh, which some of us thought was a great idea, but some people didn't. And so there was a demonstration there, and it was raucous, and it was noisy. People argue that noise and disruption on a college campus is just as legal as the other activity that it's about. Does somebody get less free speech? Don't know. But that's part of a discussion that we have to have. Anyway, some of the people came and took some of the placards and tore them up. And what happened? The campus police did interact. I think one person got charged, and the police sort of escorted people out of the way. Exactly as Dr. Lindsay talked about, those actions that are described by this model legislation are being done right now on college campuses, and I think that's an important thing.
Thank you. My next question, and Senator Seliger, you did a nice job here. I'm old enough also to remember how raucous it was on some college campuses that I was at in the 70s. Let me ask the three of you to help us discover what is First Amendment law on this issue. Specifically, what does the court say about a talk being raucous? When does it cross the line to be a violation of the First Amendment? And specifically by that I mean what is called the heckler's veto. Right? Heckler's veto simply means this. Say, senator's invited to give a speech, but there are people screaming so much that he can't speak. So in effect, through their heckling, they vetoed it. So I'd just be interested in hearing from the three of you, what is the court's view of that, of the heckler's veto? Where does it stand in the court's First Amendment jurisprudence? Any of you can address this.
Well, there are a lot of students nowadays think that the First Amendment is essentially a shouting contest, but that's really not the case. The thought of many students is, well, the speaker is speaking, and now I can speak louder than he can, and so can all of my fellow students, and whoever speaks loudest wins. That's really not the way it works. And courts have recognized this. The term heckler's veto is established from various court cases. You had a case out in University of California, Irvine, a group called the Irvine 8 or the Irvine 10. These were pro-Palestinian organization which shouted down a pro-Israel speaker. They were convicted by the district attorney of disturbing the peace. You don't really have a right to silence someone else. And by the way, people who come to listen have a right to listen as well. Now, the Goldwater model takes the discipline provisions from something called the Woodward Report, which was created for Yale in 1974. They had had about a decade-long period of disinvitations and shout-downs, just like we see now. This went on during the height of the 60s and into the early 70s. And so the Woodward Report said, you know, we really have to start suspending or expelling the students who do these shout-downs, but more important, we have to warn them ahead of time so that we won't have to suspend them or expel them. Warning them will act as a deterrent. And if you look at the regulations of most colleges, they already have discipline provisions, rather like the Goldwater bill. It's just that they don't enforce them. I would say that in the last 2 years, I don't know of a single case where even the most severe shout-down has been significantly disciplined by a school. And in the couple cases where it did occur, for example, when Heather McDonald was shouted down at Claremont College complex, the Claremont colleges did suspend some students, but then Pomona, which was part of the Claremont complex, let its students off, and that kind of eliminated the deterrent effect. At Middlebury, where Charles Murray was shouted down, the administrators waited until the last 2 weeks, and then they said, we're going to put a letter in the files of the students who did the shout-downs, and if they're good for the rest of the semester, we'll remove them. In other words, 2 weeks later, we'll remove them. So that was all just done under public pressure. So what we're finding is that the colleges have a right to do this. They all have regulations to that effect, but they're not enforcing them, and that is what is causing this problem to proliferate. Colleges have a right to discipline students who do this, but they don't do it. And in my view, the first responsibility of a legislature is to protect the fundamental rights of the citizens. The First Amendment doesn't enforce itself. It's supposed to be the job of the administrators to do that. Now, when you get a case like a free speech zone, a student can go to court based on the First Amendment, and almost inevitably the court will overturn the zone. But what we find in more cases than not is the college reinstitutes the zone in some form or another. And that's why a law is needed, because it's very hard for these students to go to court. It's not only an expensive process, but it's a frightening process for them, and they get in trouble. So you are allowed to discipline. Goldwater model has a lot of layers of protection in it. We give due process rights, very strong due process rights to students who are accused of anything having to do with expressive activity. None of the other models do that. That protects everyone on all sides of the issue. We have an oversight report check to make sure that discipline is neither too harsh nor too lax. But the real problem is that discipline isn't working. In the one state that has adopted the Goldwater model discipline provisions for the longest period, Wisconsin, we saw Katie Pavlich, Katie Pavlich, supporter of the Second Amendment, went to speak of University of Wisconsin-Madison, which had just adopted Goldwater-based discipline policy through the regents. And the leader of the demonstrations against her said that she had decided to take the demonstrations outside of the venue and not to do a shout-down because of the discipline policy. That's the real goal, is deterrence, not punishment.
Go ahead.
Well, I think overall, something to note, at least in Colorado, and I'm confident that it's very similar across the country, is that although the First Amendment is something that already applies to every single state and every single public institution, there's no harm in state legislatures doubling down on further protecting the First Amendment. In Colorado, before we passed the legislation, there was a lot of cases of selective enforcement. We'd have our inspired dreamers be able to march throughout campus during the presidential election, yet when our college Republicans try to march around in favor of President Trump, they were asked to go to the free speech zone. They weren't allowed to go throughout campus. So yes, just because there's a First Amendment that applies to every public institution now, I challenge each legislator that I talk to at least consider doubling down on the First Amendment, to add a lot of the things that the Goldwater bill includes, especially because I like the regent accountability aspect of the bill that's being presented, because a lot of times university presidents, they're not going to report the reality of what's happening on their campus. University of Colorado's chancellor in Boulder, he didn't report the reality of free speech on his campus. He said everything's fine. When I went to the state legislature, when I went to our board of regents, his bosses, and told him what was really happening, he then was pressured into enforcing his policies and adopting the new ones that were bigger, or that were stronger than the previous ones. So I can say firsthand, as a current student still, The bipartisan efforts of students and lawmakers has further protected the First Amendment throughout the state of Colorado, especially on our major campuses, who now include it in their freshman orientation so students know what their rights are. And they have websites dedicated entirely to free speech. This is because of the legislation that we were able to pass in the state. I don't see why it can't be widespread, and I really hope that we can see more than the 26 states that are already considering it, consider it, and let's see it widespread throughout the country.
The problem with doubling down on an amendment or law is we can double down all day long and we can legislate and legislate more. Thomas Jefferson said that body legislates best that legislates least. As Dr. Kurtz pointed out, there are a lot of campuses that have these regulations in place, perfectly adequate regulations, but in a lot of cases they don't enforce them to the letter of the regulation. Does anybody think, just because the law deals with it specifically, or not so specifically but related to it, that that enforcement will be any more thorough or comprehensive than the reinforcement or the enforcement of the regulation in the first place? In fact, it is really up to us, really all of us, student bodies, teachers, certainly legislators, to ensure that those things are done in the proper way. We generally find that those pressures applied because no institution wants to be called before a legislative body and say, why did you not follow your own policy or the First Amendment? And nobody ever has a good answer. It gets really complicated. So we're going to have to double down and then triple down and quadruple down. And I think the example that I've used is here we are in this room and outside is a city street. It's not owned by the university. It's an urban campus. And so I'm talking and people out there are demonstrating and they drown me out. And so what then is the university to do? We have these 7 clearly raucous, ill-behaved people here, and they shout me down. Well, it's really these 4 people and not these 3 people. But since they're all together and they're all circling around, do we charge them or sanction them all? Now we have a problem with freedom of assembly because these 3 nice people really weren't doing anything wrong. They were just there. You got to be careful when you go legislate, double down, add on, and make sure you do things that you can enforce.
Marcus, you look like you, no?
Go for it.
Next question I want to ask is, I mean, it's clear from this discussion we're all in favor of free speech. But we know that even with the wide latitude that the court gives to the First Amendment over the last 100 years of its free speech jurisprudence, of course, there are time, place, manner restrictions. You can't defame someone, you can't issue terroristic threats, all kinds of restraints. My question for you 3 is, what about hate speech? Right? And what about civility? Where does that play into this debate over the First Amendment?
Well, in public debate, there's often a tension raised between the idea of free speech and civility. The idea is that if you allow free speech, someone's going to say something hateful, and that undermines civility. So for the sake of civility, you have to control speech. I don't think it works that way. From my perspective, free speech is a kind of training in civility. You think about the famous phrase by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, which is that true freedom of speech isn't freedom for thought that agrees with us, it's freedom for the thought that we hate. Now imagine that someone is saying something that you hate. Your impulse is obviously to shut them down physically if necessary, but you don't do that. You restrain yourself. You allow someone to speak even though they're saying something that you hate. That is a kind of training in self-control. This is why the founders believed that freedom depended on virtue. Personal virtue was the key to freedom. And this really is why the United States was always thought of as being far more peaceful than Europe, which was susceptible to civil strife for generations, France in particular, but Europe in general. Our tradition of liberty kept us peaceful because it meant you control yourself even when someone is saying something that you hate. So I think the greatest training in civility is freedom in general and freedom of speech in particular.
I think it's true that the virtuous are the people who deserve liberty, but everybody gets it. The simple fact of the matter is I serve in the Texas legislature. Try to enforce by statute civility, good luck. Put a big prison term on it and you'll still get about 20 minutes of civility, and that's all. And civility is what we learn from our mothers. It will not be enforced by statute. Who will determine what civility is? And so Dr. Kurtz says, Seliger, you're an absolute moron and an idiot. It sounds uncivil, but comparatively, he may say something far worse about me. So by comparison, that is civil. The simple fact of the matter is hate speech. It is reprehensible and it is terrible, but it is at the very foundation, as Dr. Kurtz pointed out, that's what the First Amendment is about, the freedom to say things that people abhor. Nobody ever got in trouble for saying America's great. And, well, not at any thinking or reasoning assemblage. Do you know, in Germany today, it is against the law to give the old traditional Nazi salute or display a swastika. As a Jewish individual, I think that is a great law. Do I think that ought to be the law in the United States? I do not. Because that is part of free speech too. And our children need to know what things are clearly reprehensible and intolerable to the conscience of well-meaning, law-abiding, and civil people. And those are some of the things that we deal with. But associating free speech with civility, you just can't do it because you cannot impose it. You can only encourage it. You can only exemplify it.
Yeah, on college campuses, the term hate speech has really been weaponized by campus administrators to stifle people's points of view, especially in classrooms, out on the campus. And really what it is, the tough thing, every single one of us up on this stage and throughout this room, if we had to define what hate speech is, would have a different definition. And it's very difficult, like the senator said, to have civility on college campuses. At least in Boulder, you can't say "Make America Great Again" without getting people very mad at you. When I ran as student body president, it came out that I was a conservative. There was posters up the next day that I was a sexual predator. There's no civility. Well, there is some. Across the country on college campuses, civility is very tough. And if you start letting administrators dictate what is and what isn't hate speech, that's going to start censoring students. I think the legislation's good because it really adds some extra parameters that if a university does have a biased response team, which that's a whole nother debacle, that investigates hate speech issues, and then it sanctions students who are just expressing their points of view. There's tons of examples. Like at South Carolina University, I can't say, let's go play a round of golf, because that might be offensive to students who can't afford to play a round of golf. And that was labeled as hate speech. We need to make sure that every single student can say, within reason, within the reason that the Supreme Court has set out, say whatever they choose, especially if they're engaging in intellectual conversation. At the end of the day, universities need to be a place not where students are taught what to think, but how to think. And by starting adding hate speech on top of that, you rob students of the ability to think for themselves.
A couple of examples. When we talk about the South Carolina situation, clearly it's absolutely ridiculous to think of it as hate speech, but was any action taken? Some people are always going to think something is intolerable and things like that. You can't do anything about it. But let's talk about another example.
South Carolina, the student was brought forth to the Code of Conduct office.
And what happened?
From there, they had a hearing and it was dismissed.
We're going to go through things like that. But once again, the First Amendment prevailed in the strict adherence. It may not always. Let's talk about an example at Texas State in San Marcos, which, if you've not been there, is a great place. They had somebody, I think it was last year or the year before, put up handbills on poles along with the ones that said, water polo meets on Thursday and the knitting team meets on Wednesday, and somebody put up some stuff that was some white nationalist stuff. Reprehensible, I think, to most people. What did Texas State do, and what should they do? What I would tell President Trout, who's an extraordinary administrator, you either have to take them all off or leave them all on, as reprehensible as that speech is. And I think that's the policy that they're following.
Well, at Texas State, speaking with one of my colleagues who is a student there, he was working with the college Republicans to host a women's empowerment event. And the event got rejected and denied. And although it's hard to actually prove that it was based off the content of the event, on the what they were given back, it said you should go host this event at a church. And so the legislation will at least give students an avenue to challenge what the school said through the legal system if it gets to that point. And I think that's invaluable as a student. And it, like I said, it doesn't just protect the conservative students, it protects all students. That women's empowerment event could have challenged somebody in the way that they thought. They could have changed their mind. And by encouraging this dialogue, that's preparing our future leaders of Texas, of Colorado, of this nation to be as well-rounded as they can possibly be. And universities is where they're going to learn these skills.
Marcus, you mentioned bias response teams. Would you briefly describe what those are for the audience?
Yeah, I think Stanley might be able to go more into detail about the case currently in Texas. But bias response teams at the University of Northern Colorado is where I first saw them, just about an hour and a half away from Boulder. They're these teams that when a student sends in a complaint saying that there's something discriminatory said about them or towards them, or there's something discriminatory written in the bathroom, this team goes in and investigates, usually overbroadly, and tries to place sanctions on students. A lot of times, at least in Northern Colorado, they got the wrong student a couple of times who wasn't even a part of the situation. But I'll let Stanley talk more in depth about the issue here in Texas, because I know it recently came to fruition through a lawsuit.
Right, there's a group called Speech First that has filed a lawsuit on behalf of 3 students at the University of Texas, Austin. UT Austin has a very problematic, I think, unconstitutionally broad speech code, and it's got a bias response team. In this case, I think it's called Community CCRT, Campus Climate Response Team, I think is the name of it, at UT Austin. You're allowed to make, you're encouraged to make anonymous reports, and I believe even secondhand anonymous reports are allowed. We've had over 1,000 reports in the last 2 years, I think. And the code, the speech code, allows the university to decide whether you're unnecessarily adding rhetoric to a political point you're making. And it says that if you ridicule people, and then it mentions things like race and gender and minority status, but it also mentions political affiliation and ideology. So if you ridicule, someone says they like Bernie Sanders and you say something that he perceives as ridiculing socialism, you could theoretically be reported. They had, I don't know if you've heard, I think Turning Point has done these affirmative action bake sales where they charge you, student charges you a different amount of money based on your race or your gender to make a point against affirmative action. They had over 200 reports after the affirmative action bake sale. And so what all of this does, and it doesn't always depend on people being convicted, although people do get convicted, it creates an atmosphere in which you self-censor. You are afraid because you don't want to be investigated. You don't want to be reported on. You don't want to get caught up in the bureaucratic meat grinder, so to speak. And so you just shut up. And that's the problem we're seeing on these campuses. And this system has been created by administrators who supposedly are supposed to be enforcing the First Amendment. But I think this shows that we can't depend on the administrators to handle the First Amendment. And the Goldwater bill not only enshrines principles that prevent this in law, but there is an oversight system based in the regents rather than the administrators Now, that is not a guarantee of perfection, but the administrators will now know, hey, there's going to be an annual report that my bosses are going to put out. They have the power to fire me. It's going to go to the legislature and the public. There are always some people in the legislature who want to cut my money. If there's a bad report, maybe they'll use that as an argument. It gives a reason in the mind of the administrator to think twice about just giving in to the demands of the students who don't favor free speech on campus. And that's why I think it's a good idea.
I have some particularly deprecating things to say about socialism, and if somebody wants to report those to a bias response committee, please, by all means. I'm interested to see the result and the outcome of the University of Texas case, which was filed about 3 weeks ago. And because normally when people are sanctioned for a violation of law, it is for specific violation of some sort of principle, statute, or law. Not because it was too broad, because in that broadness it might specifically deal with the offense going on. And so a case that's based just upon the broadness of the measure, I think it's going to be very, very difficult. It's going to be an interesting piece of legislation. Of litigation.
We have about 25 minutes for questions from the audience. We have folks who will be coming around with a microphone, so if you raise your hand, they will come find you. And we have... And we ask, please keep your question as brief as you can.
Sure thing. My name is Saurabh Sharma. I'm the chairman of Young Conservatives of Texas at UT. We were actually the group that put on the affirmative action bake sale, as well as the event in support of Justice Kavanaugh. And I'll say one thing, Senator Seliger, we did not know at the moment that someone was just going to destroy our property. Someone was running towards us and was proceeding to tear stuff up. You have no way of knowing in that moment whether or not it's just going to be property damage or damage upon our person. And maybe I'll be fine, but Lillian Bonin right here was there as well, as was Homer, as was Leighton. A lot of us could have been hurt that day. And so it's the university's responsibility to protect our speech, no matter what. However, I will say, you keep saying that the universities aren't going to change their mindset if you keep on legislating on top of it. There's one condition under which they will, which is if you make their funding to educate the citizens of Texas, the funding that they're allocated to educate the people of Texas contingent upon protecting the free speech, because this isn't just about 1 or 2 college students. We'll be fine. It's about making conservatism illegal at Texas college campuses, which is quickly happening.
Thank you. We have someone over here.
Who are the principled opponents of free speech, or is it just done on a subject matter basis that people don't want a particular speaker? But are there actually people opposed to free speech as a principle?
Not that I am aware of, no. Free speech as a principle, no. It generally tends to be subject to subject, individual, but individual in my experience.
Well, there are certain professors on college campuses, and not all of them are straight about this. A lot of them keep a foot in both camps. But if you really follow what's taught on college campuses nowadays, it's very often not classical liberalism of, say, the type that John Stuart Mill would believe in. The argument instead is, and to be simplistic about this, but I'm quoting protesters, some of them held up signs at the University of Virginia, for example, when the ACLU was speaking, and their protest chants, and they shouted her down, was liberalism is white supremacy. At NYU, there was a shout down, and the law students were shouting, rule of law is white supremacy. Now, so there is a general argument that and this comes originally from Marx, the idea that individual liberty is just a mask for the interests of oppressive people who hold power. Maybe it's capitalists originally, now maybe it's white men, whatever. And this analysis you will find very popular in especially in what are called the studies departments, various kinds of ethnic studies, race studies, all the different forms of studies. they're coming out of a perspective that comes from, I don't want to get too detailed here, Michel Foucault, postmodernist French stuff. They don't really believe in liberty. How many of them will tell you that if you bring them into a public speech? Well, maybe half of them. The other half, will hedge. But there is a real problem. These students aren't getting these ideas, just by inventing them out of nowhere. They're coming from their classes.
Yeah. In addition, as a student, there are numerous student organizations, one in Colorado called Students Against White Supremacy. I think everybody's against white supremacy, so I don't know why they named it that. But they don't want the free exchange of ideas. They don't want to have free speech. At events that we've hosted in Colorado for Turning Point, we'll go out and try and engage with people who disagree with us. We encourage people to come to our chapter meetings who disagree with us. They don't want to have a conversation. They don't want to talk. They don't support free speech. And then just to echo what my fellow panelists said, some professors don't allow free speech in the classroom. Luckily at University of Colorado, political affiliation is a protected class, but a lot of students don't know about that. But I've had professors tell me to leave class, that if I want to bring my capitalist agendas to the classroom, and share them with my colleagues, I need to do it on my own time, not during class after she just got done talking about how the Swedish healthcare system was the best healthcare system our world has ever seen. So I think professors as well as students alike, there are a handful of them out there who don't believe in free speech.
The point was made earlier about how difficult it is to define hate speech, and whether you call it hate speech or free speech, I think is up to the beholder. Has been a thought given by any of you about the teaching of basic civility courses at the college level?
And so personally, at the University of Colorado system, I've partnered with a couple of our Board of Regent members to explore the idea of including a mandatory civics class, prerequisite core requirement for students who go through our system. Students coming in, if the idea pans out, hasn't come to fruition yet, can test out of it coming from high school. If they know what the civics are, if they know how our country was developed, if they realize that it's the greatest country in the history of the earth because of our principles, they don't have to take it. I'd encourage them to still take it. But that is something that we're looking into. We're partnering with the faculty currently. And if we are able to find something successful, we'll gladly hand over the blueprint per se to other universities who want to encourage civics education, because students need to have a strong understanding of civics before we can even start expecting them to engage in civil conversation protected by the First Amendment.
I think you've got a hard time teaching civility. I think we should urge and emphasize civility all the time. And so if you tell somebody that they have a bad idea and they got there because their reasoning capability is almost non-existent, somebody is going to think that uncivil. And so what are you going to do? Once again, most of the things that we learn about civility, we learn from our mothers. And it's also kind of in the golden rule as well. It's just a very complicated thing to do. It's an admirable goal, and everybody ought to behave civilly. But I guarantee you in legislative bodies, you can make it punishable by 5 to 20, and you're not going to get it.
A couple things. I guess my concern, Senator, is that in legislative bodies, while there is coercive power from the Speaker and the Speaker's lieutenants over members, or the Lieutenant Governor over members, and we've certainly seen that in the prior sessions, the coercive power of professors and administrators over students on campuses is much stronger and jeopardizes their entire future and their entire career. So it concerns me to hear that really there's nothing we can do any more than we have to try to keep political correctness and expansive definitions of hate speech from being reined in. And I would just endorse what the students said before, that legislators hold the purse strings of every single one of these administrators on campus. And as a taxpayer, I shouldn't have my state dollars and my tax dollars enforcing political correctness and stifling speech on campus. And so I guess I would just like to see the legislature, whether it's formal, informal, new laws, crackdowns, hearings, let the administrators know, the president of each institution, the regents, the vice president of student affairs, the dean of students, that this is completely unacceptable to the legislature, and that the legislature is going to, whether it's hold committee hearings, whatever, is going to do something about it. If not pass new laws, use the bully pulpit, something.
Which is precisely what we're going to do. When this bill comes up, and if it comes up in the committee that I'm chairing, it's exactly the dialogue we intend to have. And we'll bring a bunch of university professors up here specifically. University of Texas and Texas State and Texas Southern, what are you going to do and what are the circumstances and things like that. You have to be careful about the sanctions, because we can say something that we don't like at the University of Texas, we're going to remove some of the funding. Well, they get a lot of money from the Permanent University Fund, and so they can suffer disproportionately a whole lot less than, say, Sol Ross or Stephen F. Austin. You got to be careful and make sure that it's equal throughout the sanction.
Yes, I can recall very well when the conservative students were having the pro-Kavanaugh signs at UT, and a video went viral on national news of this blonde student who went around actually tearing up the Kavanaugh signs. And I wrote a letter to the president of UT asking what disciplinary action is going to be taking place, and I got an email back from Carlos Martinez, who was the chief of staff of the president of UT. It was a very nebulous letter where he emailed saying, we're trying to determine if the actions of this student went beyond acceptable limits of conduct, and never got any other response besides that. And they said any disciplinary action would be confidential. So I think if state laws are being formulated, they have to be very clear about what is the violation of First Amendment rights, including tearing up placards or intimidating. No, I think this is absolutely wrong, and it's got to be clear what is acceptable and what is not.
And I was told, and correct me if I'm wrong, that one student was charged with a misdemeanor. And I don't know what disciplinary action is going to be taken, and we'll know more as time goes by and the president reports. But clearly they were there with some campus security people, and they were involved. Now, were they involved enough? And why not? Why didn't they have more people? Did they not anticipate the counter demonstration? While you have to, for the demonstration that you have, in most campuses, you need to tell them where and when and things like that so they can determine security. For that counter demonstration, they don't have to say, we're going to be there counter demonstrating. And so were they prepared as they should have been for that demonstration? That I don't know, but I think that they have yet to resolve what all is going to be done, but I think something will be done.
Can I just say that, again, the best way to handle this, I think, is by having a freshman orientation, and the Goldwater bill includes this, where you tell students about free speech in general, because telling them the principles means most, but also you inform them of the discipline policy. And then when the first problem comes up, you take it very seriously. And I think after that, you're not going to have a lot of other problems. But somehow nobody tries this. Somehow I think Texas gets this, but, we'll see, but it seems pretty elementary. You tell them, and if they cross the line, you do something about it, and then I think you're not going to have a lot of line crossing.
Also, I'm not entirely sure how it makes sense that one group, if they wanted to have a pro-Kavanaugh discussion, has to reserve their space ahead of time and let the campus know ahead of time of their presence, but then the counter-protest doesn't. I don't think either of the organizations should be required to notify the campus. I encourage them to for security purposes. But if you're on a college campus as a student, you see security personnel, you see staff throughout the campus all the time. If there is a situation where there are large groups gathering, the security officers, the police department, tend to come. And I haven't been at a single university that hasn't been the case.
Hi, my name's Isabel. I'm a student activist that gets to work with Marcus from Turning Point USA, and I also am a college student in Colorado, although at the rival school, so go Rams, I gotta say that. But I just have to tell you all, if you are unaware of what's going on college campuses, or this is the first time you've heard of this issue beyond 3 or 4 stories on Fox News, you are in for a rude awakening. We students deal with more problems than you could possibly imagine on any given day on our campuses. And even if you only graduated 3 or 4 years ago, things have so drastically spiraled out of control that this legislation is desperately needed. At Colorado State University, I was formally reprimanded at my job for saying you guys instead of y'all, which isn't a very common phrase in Colorado, because I wasn't including every possible gender identity. A few weeks ago, even after the passage of this legislation, our university tried to put out a statement that saying long time no see was deemed completely irrelevant on campus and that students shouldn't be saying it because it was derogatory to those of Asian descent. Luckily, because of the passage of this legislation, students could fight back on that, and that was deemed irresponsible for the university to have put out that statement. But I encourage you, dive deeper into this conversation. I personally, from my 3.5 years of university, could fill books and books and books with the stories that I deal with, and I'm not even a political science student. I table on campus every other day for Turning Point USA, but I'm studying biomedical sciences to become a doctor, and this still infiltrates my classroom on a daily basis. I've seen a notable change since we've passed our legislation in Colorado. Our free speech zone is eliminated, so students have more freedom to say what they want to on campus or in the classroom, and even on their social media, which, believe it or not, does get policed by the university for what is appropriate for a student to be saying or not on campus. And students do get expelled and suspended and sanctioned each and every day simply for saying things like America is great, which is now a very controversial statement. Ask any college student in this room or any college student in your lives, whether that's your children, your grandchildren, nieces and nephews, it is desperately time for a change on American college campuses, and I urge Texas to take a good look at this legislation.
Hi, I'm a military veteran, and I get to speak on college campuses about defending the First Amendment, and well received there, having family members from my father to my grandfather to my great-great-grandfather and my son who have all served. And defending all of our rights under the Constitution is near and dear to me because I put my life on the line for it. But the question I have, because I'm really open both to Senator Seliger's perspective that you can't regulate, you can only do so much to regulate, doubling down has a certain effect. How does what you're looking for, and I'm open to be persuaded from both of you, how is what you're looking for with this legislation compared to other civil rights that may get affected, like your skin color and being able to sit at a lunch counter at a classroom? Is what you're looking for with this Goldwater legislation on par and just as burdensome to college campuses? And the illustration I'll give you is I was walking with a black veteran down by UT while they were protesting the war. We were both heckled for wearing veteran gear, and he said if they'd come up and done to me because of the color of my skin, there'd be repercussions at that university. But because they heckled me due to my veteran status, there will be no repercussions. And so when somebody's rights are violated from their skin color or their gender, is this legislation on par when it comes to defending their right to free speech, or is it more onerous than that? And I'd like to hear both perspectives. Are we asking for more or the same?
Well, it's a complicated question. I don't think it's more onerous. It's interesting now that on the federal level, colleges are very much on notice that they will lose their eligibility for federal aid under what's called Title IV of the Higher Education Act. In other words, all the student aid. If the college does anything that is considered discriminatory on the basis of sex or race, that's it. You'll lose your aid. And if there's even a hint of a red flag, the college will get right because they won't be able to survive without that. But there are free speech provisions in the Higher Education Act, but they're all sense of the Congress provisions. And so colleges can violate with impunity. So right now, we actually take it for granted that colleges cannot violate and discriminate based on race and sex. First Amendment and free speech is an equally fundamental right, but we don't do much about that. Now, it's important to be careful. We have these layers of protection in the Goldwater. One can argue about it one way or the other. But right now, there isn't equivalent protection for free speech as there is on these other areas.
there's nothing in this legislation that is more onerous. Dr. Kurt's absolutely right. It's interesting the example you talk about being said that it is improper to say you guys, but it's okay to say y'all. I don't think there's any official sanction for that, but let's point out something else. You can't fix stupid. And the people who said it then are stupid, and they're going to continue to be stupid, but you can't go and legislate for every single eventuality. But, as Dr. Lindsay pointed out, in a bunch of campuses and more, progress is being made evolutionarily in this case because people realize how important the principles are of free speech and free expression and how fundamental they are to higher education. So let's say this thing doesn't pass at all in this session. It didn't pass last session. What happens? We will continue to evolve toward free speech and things like that. We will do away with free speech zones. You can't have a zone where the First Amendment applies and here it doesn't apply. However, there are areas in college campuses where if they become very congested, you have problems with public safety, access and egress. Colleges have to be able to regulate that. They should do so with public input, student input, I think. But those kind of challenges are going to stay with us.
Thank you, Senator. We've only got a few minutes left here. Let me try as inadequately as I will do it to summarize the wonderful insights that we've heard from all three of our guests. And here, I want to speak directly to the issue of the shout-down or the heckler's veto, which the Supreme Court has ruled unconstitutional consistently. Let me just speak from my experience, 30 years as a college professor, teaching Plato's Republic just about every year. Now, when students study Plato's Republic, the most famous book on justice, they encounter right in book one the argument against justice, the argument against politics. And that's put forward by a rhetorician by the name of Thrasymachus. And he says to Socrates, Socrates, you want to know what justice is? I'll tell you. Justice is the advantage of the stronger, right? It's called today might makes right, right? The tyrant's maxim. Now, fortunately, Socrates is free to debate and therewith to refute Thrasymachus. But my fear is that if the heckler's veto comes to be viewed as just a legitimate exercise of free speech, as allowing an invited speaker to be heard, then what this will teach our students is that justice is the advantage of those with stronger vocal cords. That justice is the advantage of those who are better able to intimidate into silence those who disagree with them, right? But we all know, left, right, and center, that the success of any democracy depends on our exercising the self-restraint that we need to be able to listen to others. Democratic dialogue requires that we listen to others. Without it, we degenerate into barbarism, right? Those, I think, are the stakes, because Abraham Lincoln is said to have said that the philosophy taught in the classroom in this generation will be the philosophy practiced in the legislature in the next. My fear, and here I'm the one who said this was a good news panel, but I also have my fears, right? My fear is this: if free speech is lost in our public universities in just a very short amount of time, it'll be lost in the public square, right? Please join me in thanking our three panelists.